I'm Venus with Galaxy Inc. And for this week's writing tips, we are going to be starting a 4-part series that I am calling Back to the Basics. We will be covering sentences, word choice, paragraphs, and clarifying text. And we'll get a little bit more into all of those so that you'll know exactly what I mean. Now, when I say back to the basics, I am not referencing elementary school education and like sentence structure. I'm not going to be diagramming a sentence. I'm not talking about past participles. I'm not going to be talking about a verb or a noun. We're going to assume that you know basic English, that you understand how to form a sentence, and what you're trying to do is become a better writer. And that's the whole point of my vlog, and this is the whole point of this series, is to help you become a better writer. For the first week, we are going to be talking about sentences and sentence structure and how that can apply to your writing, whether you write fiction or nonfiction, how important it is. Now, I do have a lot of notes to kind of remind myself, so if you see me kind of shifting off and looking off camera, it's because I'm trying to kind of remember the next step or the thing that I was trying to talk about. I'll do my best not to cut too much over, but that way I don't have a whole bunch of cuts within the video. I'm also going to try and learn a new video technique for this, which is to add blocks with text underneath of them so that you can see what I'm talking about visually, since sentence writing is very visual, and I'm going to try to get that into here. I'm going to say try. I'm going to do it. I'm going to do it. You'll see I can do it. Every time I do a video, I feel like I'm learning something new, and this is my next thing that I've got to learn how to do. Now, I want to be clear that some of the things I'm going to talk about are more beginner skills and some are more intermediate. As you learn to write, as you become a better writer, some of these things are going to come more naturally to you, and some of these things are going to feel very new if you've never written a book or a short story or anything like that before. And for some of you, you're going to listen to some of this and it's going to feel like old hat. You'll be like, I know that already. First thing I want to talk about, and I feel like this is a very beginner skill, is wordiness. I think a lot of authors they make the mistake of thinking that if you add a bunch of words and you're very verbose and you put lots of stuff in there, that is better, and that having a higher word count or anything. But George Eliot has this quote that he says, "Blessed is the man who, having nothing to say, abstains from giving wordy evidence of the fact." In other words, let's not be wordy. And I don't think you have to be expansive with your writing all the time. You need to write what needs to be there, not all this extra stuff that just fills up space. That feels very elementary school, where you were told you had to write 250 words, and so you're like adding in words just to, up that word count so you don't have to write as much. But it shows through in writing, and it kind of sets apart good writing from bad writing. So an example, a good sentence is, "He carries a briefcase that is made out of leather." It's a very nice sentence. I mean, it's not horrible, right? But there's a lot of words there that don't need to be there, because what it should say is, "He carries a leather briefcase." That's it. It's very simple. We've cut out a whole bunch of words. He carries a briefcase that's made out of leather, as opposed to "he carries a leather briefcase." It is shorter. It is more to the point, it's more direct, and it gets the point across just as well, and you don't need all those extra words in there. The next thing I want to talk about is length of sentence. We all know about run-on sentences. Like, you don't want to have like the sentence that just goes on and on and on and on, but sentences also can be used to control your reader. It creates balance and breaks, commas or breaths. Periods are moments where you can pause. And so when we are using sentence and sentence length, we can kind of control how fast or slow the reader is reading. If you have short sentences in an action scene, the reader reads faster. Their eye moves faster across the page. Even with those periods in there as breaks, the eye moves faster. And there's studies that have been done by this. So having those shorter sentences and making it more clipped makes the reader read faster, which makes the action scene go faster, which makes you feel like you're in the moment. So you're kind of, as the author, using sentence structure to up the ante a little bit as you're writing. Now, if you want something more languid or more poetic, you can slow it down a little bit. You can make your sentences longer. You can give them more breaks. You can add things like em dashes and obviously if it works, it works. We don't want run-on sentences, but there is a way to make these more languid sentences that aren't super wordy, because I know we just talked about that. There is a way to do it that lets the reader flow through a little slower. And that's what you want in a slower scene. If you want your reader and you're writing nonfiction to disseminate information and you want them to not be bored, then obviously having slightly shorter sentences is going to work a little bit better. Not super clipped, because you're writing nonfiction, which is more formal than fiction, where you can almost like make one-word sentences sometimes. This way you can control how your reader is reading and give them the opportunity to take in some of that information, especially in nonfiction. When we are speaking, we also have a habit of using these words like now and of course and however and as I said before. And the problem with those is that they work sometimes, but just like any kind of sentence structure issue, you want to make sure that you're not using it all the time. The one that I see the most common, especially in nonfiction when I'm editing, is as I said before. And the problem with this one is that I usually see them making a comment of something they said before, one paragraph up. The reader has not forgotten that quickly what you said before. You don't need to remind them. That's what the beginning of that sentence is. It's a clarifying statement. As I said before, comma, and then you give the information. If you just said it, you don't need to remind them again. If you said it 3 chapters ago, you do need to remind them. And that's when that works. As I said before, in chapter 5, and then give the information just as a quick reminder. You don't have to go back through everything again. And that's why that part of the sentence works. But if you're using that constantly, however, and as you'll see, and then the next sentence says, of course, and the next sentence is now, the sentence just doesn't flow as well. And it starts to become really obvious. If you're using them all the time, it becomes super obvious. And it shows that you are having trouble figuring out a way to clarify your sentences and without kind of almost like these verbal tics that are in it. And we'll get a little bit more into verbal tics in a minute. The next thing I'm going to talk about is passive voice. This is my struggle. I am so bad with passive voice. It's not that I don't understand what passive voice is. It's that when I'm writing, for some reason, I just do it. And I think some of it is because I do read a lot of older books and books that are like considered classics. And passive voice was a very popular way of writing back with the Dickensian and T.S. Eliot and, you know, these older authors, dead authors. And so I have a tendency to kind of insert those into my own work and when I'm writing. So a bad example or an example of a passive voice would be, why was the road crossed by the chicken? Instead of why the chicken crossed the road. Now, what has happened to make it a passive voice is that the subject has changed. The chicken is not the main subject of the sentence now. It is now the road. The road is now the main part of the sentence, which doesn't make sense within the context. It also sounds very old style, and by doing that, and when you do it in like fiction, you're doing it with a character, it also sometimes makes the sentence confusing because then you don't know who the subject in the sentence is. And especially if you're using lots of he's or she's, and then it gets all kinds of wonky. And again, like I said, I struggle with this one. I kind of do it myself, and then somebody either has to point it out or I catch it later. It sounds nice to me for some reason, so that's why I keep doing it, but it doesn't work. It's not technically grammatically incorrect. Grammatically, you can write in passive voice. The problem is that it makes the sentence confusing. So if you can avoid passive voice, especially if you're writing a modern book, then you probably should. A way that you would know if you're including passive voice in there is you look for those to be verbs. The is, are, am, was, were, have, has been, had been, and will have been. Okay, sorry. I was trying to remember. I learned that in like 3rd or 4th grade, so I was trying to remember the to be verbs. Look at those and don't take them out. Just look at them, and usually there might be passive voice kind of surrounding those to be verbs, and that is just kind of how it works. The next thing I want to talk about is filtering. You might not have heard this term. I've known about what filtering is, but did not know it had a name called filtering until a couple of years ago when I was in grad school. So filtering is words or phrases that only your character would say. And you use a sentence in a way, or you describe things in a way that only your character would describe them. In other words, if you're writing a character or a book that's set in medieval times in the 11th century, it would be really weird if they made a metaphor or a simile comparing things to a car. Your character doesn't know what a car is. Same thing though, that's an extreme example. If you are writing a medieval story, again from the viewpoint of a peasant who's never met anybody wealthy, then they would not make comparisons to things looking like her hair looked like gold. They've never seen gold. They would probably say her hair looked like the color of corn. And so you got to find these filtering words and ways of writing sentences the way that your character would create them. And we'll talk more in the next video, in the next video about word choice and how that works. And filtering is a part of that, but it's also a part within our sentences. And so we have to be sure that as we're writing these sentences, we're also using the character, or we're describing the way a character would. If you're writing nonfiction, you need to really make sure that you are using words that your reader is going to understand, because that is your audience, right? For example, if you're writing a very technical book about, network engineering and the CCIE, then you will have a different audience, and you'll definitely want to direct your language towards those people in ways that they'll understand, as opposed to if you were trying to explain network engineering to a layman who's never ever done it and they don't really understand it, you would use a very different language to talk to them. And it's not like you're speaking a different language fully, but you need to make sure you're connecting to your reader and filtering in a way that they understand. The next thing I want to talk about is metaphors and cliches. We're going to kind of put those two together. And the reason why is, since we're just talking about sentences, when we're putting in metaphors into our text, keep it simple. Don't go overly flowery. So I'm going to read some of these. I actually found a website. I'll see if I can't link it below. But it was a website of actual writing examples of things that students have turned in to teachers as metaphors. All right, so here's one. His thoughts tumbled in his head, making and breaking alliances like underpants in a dryer without cling-free. And another one, my favorite. The ballerina rose gracefully in point and extended one slender leg behind her like a dog on a fire hydrant. What? What? Florence King says writers who have nothing to say always strain for metaphors to say it in. It's okay to have metaphors. Keep it simple. Keep it not cliche, which some of these ones that I just read are not cliche at all, but they're ridiculous. They're just ridiculous. They don't make any sense. Nobody's going to understand them. Of course, the problem with creating metaphors is that you don't want to be cliche. And so you also don't want to include things like, he was driving her up the wall. Everybody knows what that means. But now you're heading into cliche territory. Now you're using phrases that aren't original to you. And you're not providing your readers with something that really excites their imagination. They just read a cliche metaphor that they've heard 1,000 times. And the last thing I want to talk about are crutch words. And even though this might go into the words video, I think that it needs to go into our sentence video, because crutch words are words that you're constantly using as you write, and you just kind of insert them without even thinking about it. I have several. Just, seems, and ever. I am constantly putting those in there. I don't know why. Other crutch words that are common are very, definitely, slightly, probably, basically, look, feel. Those words just kind of, they kind of just insert themselves in there as you're writing, and you don't even realize you're putting them in there. And so they become parts of your sentence. And here's the thing, when I go back and I do a global search of like the word just, I find that I don't even need it, like at all. I do not need this word in my writing. It rarely adds anything to the sentence. And so I take them out. I usually take them all out. Every now and then one will stay where it really needs to be seamed. It needs to have just in there, but for the most part, it doesn't need it. I will say there's an exception to this rule, which is dialogue. If your character uses a word all the time, like constantly, like when we speak, that's okay. Go ahead, use that word. Make sure it is your character that's saying it though, not you. Your character needs to be the one saying the word over and over. It needs to stick out that it's that character. If your character is always like, dude, or if your character is always like totally, then you need to put that in there, but make sure it's not your word that's inserting. I am going to tell you a fun thing that you can do if you feel like doing a little project. Is there are several websites out there where you can put in your text. You can put in a chapter or even a whole book into an algorithm, and it'll show you in almost a visual way all of your words that you're using in your book, and the ones that you use the most. And it's really interesting to look at that and see what words you're using over and over and over again. And that's when you'll find that some of these words, obviously you're going to use a and the, articles and things like that, but there's some other words that pop in there too, and you're going, oh, I didn't realize I used that word so much. That's not so good. And you can go back through and you can start editing. This is the end of part 1 of our Back to Basics series. I'll be back with the next video on word choice. Don't forget to press like and subscribe to my channel. I post new writing tips almost every Friday. I've been Venus with Galaxy Ink. I hope your writing is out of this world.